This tutorial is part of our full-stack React Django DRF channels project, DJ Chat. You can watch this tutorial and many more from our YouTube course playlist, or the whole course, including access to additional resources from our Udemy course. The Udemy course link, which provides the best price for the course, is in the video description. Before we start building a generic or reusable CRUD component or hook, we're going to discuss and build an Axios Interceptor. Interceptors in Axios will allow us to intercept requests or responses before they're handled by the application, and that can be a really useful feature. Probably we won't really see much use of this until we start to work with the authentication, but we can definitely start to set this up now and discuss it, so it makes it easy for us to understand and implement it fully when we get to the authentication in this project. So what we're going to do here is add a new folder inside of our React application, so inside of the src here. So we're going to call this the helpers folder, and this can be a common directory used to store utility functions or helper modules or any other code snippets that provide reusable functionality across different parts of our application. And I would probably categorize the JWT Interceptor as one of these helpful utility functions. So let's go ahead and create the new helper. I never worked out why it does that. Helper, the helper or helpers folder. So I'm just going to call mine helpers. There we go. And then inside of here, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this JWT Interceptor.ts. Like I said, this is going to give us the ability to intercept requests or responses. And what we can do then is filter information from the response, for example, and maybe perform some additional actions before then it's hit back or sent back to the application. So this can be a really useful feature, and something, like I said before, we're going to be utilizing in this application, particularly when we get to handling, for example, refresh tokens. So let's go ahead and import Axios, and let's go for the Axios instance. Okay, and that's from Axios. So just bring in the tools that we need. Now what we're going to do is, for example, if we were to, or if a user were to, for example, navigate to a page that doesn't exist or try to access a resource that doesn't exist, what we can do is we can redirect them to a different page, for example. So we could capture, for example, a 401 or 403 error and then redirect them. So let's go ahead and just bring in the tools. Not entirely sure if we're going to use it right now, but let's just bring in the tools that we're going to need to redirect. So we're going to use navigate from the React Router DOM to help us reroute or to redirect users to a different resource in certain scenarios. And in addition to that, potentially what we're going to be needing is the base URL in our configuration file. So the base URL, let's grab that out from the .config file. There we go. And then we go ahead and create a constant. I'm doing that constant API base URL. That's going to equal the base URL that's been imported. Okay, right, so what's important here, which I didn't mention, the import here, so Axios and the Axios instance. So what we're doing here then, we've seen an example of this already using Axios. As Axios then refers to the default export of the Axios package. Okay, so this is the main Axios object that provides the core functionality for Axios, so sending requests, get requests and posts, etc. Now, something I didn't mention was the Axios instance. So this represents the type definition for the customized Axios or the customized instance of Axios. So by creating an instance of Axios using the Axios create, we can customize its behavior, such as setting default headers, interceptors, that's exactly what we're going to do, or base URLs. So the Axios instance type ensures that the instance has the same methods and properties of the default Axios object. So in short, we're going to be utilizing the Axios instance because we want to perform some additional customizations of the default behavior. This time, or this instance, we want to build an interceptor. So we're going to intercept the response or request and perform some additional functionality. Right, so we're going to be utilizing the interceptor every time we make a request to the server. And this is why we're building this first. So I'm going to call this use Axios with interceptor. Okay, yeah. Okay, so use Axios with interceptor. So let's finish this up. So here we're going to specify the Axios instance. Okay. So let's go ahead and set out our exports. Let's not worry about the issue at the moment, just we haven't set out return. So it's not going to work just at the minute. So use Axios interceptor, use Axios with interceptor. There we go. So let's just reiterate the fact that we're going to be utilizing this interceptor every time we send a request. So we're going to need to set up some parameters here. So we're going to call this JWT Axios equals. So this is Axios.create. So we're going to create a new instance of Axios, and we want to set out our base URL. So let's set that as the API base URL. Okay. And then we want to just set out the navigate equals use navigate. Yeah. And then we want to also, well, let's just stick with that for now. Let's just bring this down so it makes it easy for us to see what's going on here. Right, so all I've done here is create a new instance of Axios, and then I've gone ahead and just set up the redirection when we need it. So now we can go ahead and build our customized instance of Axios. So JWT Axios dot interceptors dot response dot use. Okay, so all we're going to do here is grab the response and then return the response. So we're going to return this response to the application. So here I'm just going to use a return JWT Axios. There we go. So all we've really done here is we've defined a new function named use Axios with interceptor that returns an instance of the Axios instance, or returns an Axios instance. So we start off then by creating a new instance of Axios called JW2 Axios, okay, through Axios create. We've then gone ahead and configured the base URL for that instance. Now at the moment we're using the navigation or use navigate. Now that's just a function that we're going to be utilizing to programmatically navigate users to a different part of the application as and when it's needed. Okay, so now what we've done here in this section here is we've created a interceptor in Axios, which is going to allow us to intercept and modify the HTTP responses before they are passed to the calling code. So what that means is that in our code, in our component, we're going to be utilizing this interceptor. So we're essentially going to pass along here the URL that we want to send a request to. We're then going to use this instance of Axios to actually send the request. And then we've set up our interceptor here to actually intercept the request or response, and then perform additional actions. So if we take a look here, for example, all we're doing is we're sending our request, and you can see we get the response, and then we return it back to the application. Now, of course, what we want to do is to actually capture any errors, for example. So here what we're going to do is exactly that. So let's set up error, async error, and then we'll go ahead and try and capture any issues. So here what we've done is we've created an asynchronous arrow function with the error parameter. So the async keyword indicates that the function will be used asynchronously or in asynchronous operations, and will return a promise. So what we want to do here, well, essentially what we're doing in this block is we're going to capture any errors and then perform any additional operations. So essentially we're intercepting at this point any errors and then performing some additional actions. Now what we want to do next is we want to be able to extract the config property from the error object and then assign it to a variable so that we can utilize it later. So in Axios, when an error occurs during a HTTP request, such as, for example, a network error or an error status code of some sort happens, the error object contains the original request configuration, including the URL, methods, headers, and other request-specific details. So the purpose here of the next code in this snippet is to capture the original request configuration in case there is an error during the HTTP request or response. And then we want to then, like I said, store that in a variable so we can access it later for further processing or to handle retries or other error-related logic. So we go ahead and just capture that, like I said, the original request. So let's just call this original request, I guess. That makes sense. So get that from error.config. Right. So now what we can do, let's run an if statement. So if, for example, let's capture the error. So error response dot status. Let's say that equals a 401 error. So if we take a look at the web documentation for 401, we can see that a 401 in actual fact is the unauthorized status code, indicating that the client request has not been completed or it lacks valid authentication credentials. Now, this is, again, something we're going to be utilizing later in this course, but we'll go ahead and add an example shortly, but we'll just add 401 for now, and then we can expand that a little bit later. Let's just put something in there for now so that we have kind of the code base padded out a little bit. So that's what the 401 HTTP is going to be utilized again for, and we're going to be utilizing that later on. We're going to need that when we start to actually set our API endpoints requiring authentication in order to access the endpoint. But hopefully you can start to see what's happening here. So in actual fact now, what we've done is we're capturing any errors. So should we return an error, so if we send a request and return an error, we're now actually performing some additional actions. So if error response is equal to 401, if we get the 401 error, then we're going to perform some sort of additional action. So let's just set that additional action for now to be to redirect the user. Now we can't use navigate directly here. So what we're going to need to do is create a new constant, go, for example, login. But let's just call this for now, go homepage or go root equals. Okay, so it's going to be navigate. And then let's just navigate them to the home page for now. And then we just need to run that. So go root. There we go. Okay, so what we've done here is that we've set this so that we intercept the response. Should the response return a 401 error, then we're going to just redirect that user to the home page. Now I realize we haven't utilized the original request details just yet, but let's just imagine, for example, that we get the 401 returning, so we're not authorized. Maybe we want to, in actual fact, just give it another go. So what we can do here potentially is then re-request to send the request again. Now remember, this time it's been captured here, it's not been sent back to the application. So this is all being done here in this interceptor. So we've sent a request from our application through this interceptor. We've got a reply from the server. It's a 401 error. So what we could potentially now do is extract the original request from the error config, and then we could run this again to see if, for example, it was just an error maybe with the server wasn't turned on or something like that. Of course, I'm just making that up. But we could then request to send that original request again and try it again. So that's how we could utilize the original request details. We're not going to do that right now, but hopefully that gives you a general idea or how we're going to be utilizing that later on in the application, and why I potentially included that now, just introducing that to get the general idea. So hopefully you can see from this code that we've now sent a request. We're going to send a request through this interceptor. Should we have a successful response from the server, all that's going to happen is that the response is going to be sent back to the application or part of the component, or the component that sent the original request. That's all that's happening here. Now, should we get an error and it's a 401 error, we're going to capture that error before we send that back to or before the application knows about that, or the component knows about that. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to redirect the user to the home page. Right, okay, so that's going to be our baseline interceptor, which is going to allow us to just get started utilizing this interceptor in our components when we start to build some CRUD operations. We will refactor, change, add to this code as and when we add new functionality to our application. Now, probably what's best at this point is to actually see this in action before we move any deeper here. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. I think in the pages we created in the secondary drawer. I haven't removed this code here. So this is an example we set out at the start just to show you how to utilize Axios. Now what we need to do here, in actual fact, instead of sending a normal Axios request through Axios, we now need to utilize the interceptor. Now remember here, we're just adding this as an example to showcase the use of using an interceptor. We're not actually adding this code base here, or this code snippet, into our project. So let's just adapt this code so that we utilize the interceptor. So first thing we would need to do, and I'll add it just here so we can clearly see what we need to remove. Okay, so just to remind myself that I need to remove this. So let's go ahead and import now the use Axios Interceptor from the helper folder there. So I'll just bring that in, and then we're going to need to bring that into the application. So function, this goes JWT Axios equals our interceptor. Okay, so we now bring our interceptor in, and now we can utilize this to actually build a request. So we're going to say now JWT Axios.get. Right, so let's give that a go. Let's go back into our application. Let's just refresh and go to our console. It looks like we're still returning data as per normal. We only have one server actually in the data set at the moment. So we're just returning one server at the moment, and this is this data right here. So let's go ahead and actually turn off the DRF server. So I'm just going to stop the server. That's the DRF server. Let's try this again. And you can see this time we are returning, well, we obviously can't access the data, and we're getting an error connection refused. So there isn't any status codes there. So let's go ahead and just run the server again. Right, so let's sidetrack a little bit here. Right, I've gone over to the server in the views, and what I'm going to do here is from REST framework, dot permissions. I'm just going to import the is authenticated. So I'm going to then utilize that here in my view set. So here I'm going to specify the fact that the user must be actually logged in to actually view this. So permission classes equals, and then I'm going to set that to is authenticated. So all I've done now is I've just specified that the user has to be authenticated to access the view set here. So hopefully now when I refresh, I am retrieving an error, a wrong error, because I've not turned the server on. So let's make sure you turn the server on, and then let's refresh again. And this time we are returning, and you can now see we're returning a 403 error, which is great. So we're actually returning a HTTP response, or HTTP status code, sorry, a 403. So we can now utilize that in our example. Right, so let's go back into our interceptor. Let's change that to a 403, and let's see if we can see there's a massive loop issue going on here. So that is going to cause a massive problem. So let's try that again. So let's go back into the code here, and you can see that's causing a massive error there, a loop. We've already sent 3,084 requests, which is not exactly what we're looking to do. Look at it go. Right, to resolve it is pretty simple here. Let's go ahead. So instead of potentially utilizing a promise reject error, we can, at this point, use a throw error to propagate the error and let it be handled then by the appropriate error handling mechanism we might have in the calling code or the component. So by throwing the error, the rejection handler completes without rejecting the promise, breaking the infinite loop. So we're going to need to add that just under here. So let's use a throw error. There you go. So by doing that, hopefully when we run the server, let's run this again. It still causes a massive loop. Okay. And now let's also remember that we're just navigating them back to the same page, and that's then going to potentially run the same request. Thus, we're going to potentially see a loop anyway. So let's just navigate them to something that doesn't exist yet, /test. And let's turn the server back on. Let's give it a go. Right, so refresh, and you can see that then navigates them successfully now to /test, which obviously doesn't exist, but just to show you an example of utilizing this interceptor. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of a grounding into utilizing this interceptor, or how we're going to be utilizing it. Now, of course, we're not going to be including it in the secondary draw directly here. We're going to be utilizing a CRUD. We're going to be creating our own hook for CRUD. So let's just go ahead now and remove this code from the secondary draw. We're not going to need that anymore. Just tidy that up. And let's move on to a next tutorial where we go ahead and start building our CRUD hook.